knew I would have to edit. And, a few people told me it's like, you're going to have to get the scissors out at some point. So, poor you. And I was like, no, I understand. In fact, the process of editing was something I was really looking forward to. And one of the reasons I really wanted to write a long form book was I just really wanted to write. I mean, I find writing to be a really joyful creative impulse. And I've always published and edited to some degree poetry journals and music essaying, and a bit of a frustrated music journalist since day one. So I've always been writing, but to write something, an extended uh, book length piece, was something I had never done for whatever reasons. A lot of preoccupation with being a musician, being in a band, being on tour, and and just sort of writing songs, et cetera, and just life itself. Uh, I would always sort of put it on the back burner. But I knew one day I sort of wanted to write a book. I wanted to have a book in a bookstore. I wanted to see the book in the bookstore window and all this kind of stuff, all that kind of glory. And the device of writing a memoir was fairly pretty much the easiest thing I could think of. A lot of people would ask me, like, "Are you ever going to write a music memoir about whatever yourself in the context of Sonic Youth?" And I said, "Yeah, but possibly." But I just wasn't really that keen on writing a memoir per se, or even using that word memoir. I kind of wanted to write about music. I wanted an essay about music, and so my initial intention was to use my life experience as a cipher of discovery in just talking about the documents, discovering at an early age these subversive texts like Patti Smith's Seventh Heaven book, from 74, 75, when it was published. And like, why did that appeal to me? Why did that resonate with me? Everything about it, the writer itself, or the writing. And I knew of her writing from rock magazines, but why was I attracted to that more marginalized take on music, as well as the music itself? So somebody like her, or somebody like Lester Bangs writing about people like Iggy Pop, or something, is like, I felt I was a bit alone in a sense, because living in rural Connecticut in my early teens, most people I associated with it in those youthful days, would people into Bachman Turner Overdrive and Yes and Emerson Lake and Palmer and Led Zeppelin, of all of which I was okay with. But I was, at the same time, I was very attracted to these, as I said earlier, subversive voices, and I kind of wondered why. And I think I kind of get into this analysis of that without ever answering it. I don't, and so I just sort of decided, like, why don't I just write about these documents and let that stand alone, as if it could sort of just tell the story without me having to go deep into my own sort of psyche and try to understand, like, why do I like punk rock, when nobody else does in my neighborhood, and so, but I try to sort of come to terms with the fact that, e- from what I can gather from my own sort of musical knowledge, is that there's a lot of impeccable creative work going on in that world that exists on the margins of what is considered the mainstream, or the more acceptable sounds and literature in the culture. So subculture to me was far more interesting, possibly because it informed culture. I mean, maybe that was it. But I certainly liked the work more. I mean, and nothing against Led Zeppelin, but I preferred Captain Beefheart. But I would say that the value is equal, but I thought the profile wasn't equal. Led Zeppelin was on the cover of every magazine. Captain Beefheart was not. So that made him more mysterious, more interesting to me. And so maybe it was the mystery of the subculture that attracted me more so than, say, the subversive qualities of it. I like that too. I like the danger and the recklessness of it. But I I kind of, I say, if I did have any answer to that analysis, I was attracted to just the mysterious otherworldliness of these writers and these people.
Well, one of the things that I can't help but notice as I read your book and reflect on your book is what a fan of music and art and culture you are. Like to the point where I think it almost gets scholarly. Like everybody who makes music or art is a fan of music and art to some degree. I mean, that's very natural. But you distinguish yourself in these pages as somebody who has an almost like encyclopedic awareness of what is happening in music in particular, and especially this music that kind of exists on the margins. And I think it gets to the point, and this is demonstrated, for example, with Nirvana, where you become very astute at seeing talent on the rise and recognizing it early. So, can you just talk about being a fan and also being a creator?
I think, a lot of my interest is so anal retentive that data is really important to me, and I know that it's like that's kind of that's a certain specific thing that I share with other record collectors and book collectors, etc., of which I used to have conflict with because there's something you could discount about people who just sort of wanted information as if they're stats, as if you're interested in baseball before like stats. And I never really was a sports person, but I did sort of like the fact that there was people who dedicated themselves to the statistics of players and their histories and team and with these teams. And I thought that kind of applied certainly to the sentient arts as well, whether it's sort of visual art or music or literature. And I kind of realized that that was okay. But I did also realize that for the casual reader, um, it's a little bit too much, and I wanted to find a balance between my fascination as a fan with the emotional resonance and that kind of wanting to know everything about that person or everything about that person's work. And, so to be a completist, like I must have every single variant of that 7-inch that you put out around the world. But, I don't really need that to actually just love what you're doing, And so I tried to have, I kind of wanted to write where there was that sort of balance of the emotional and just a statistician of being, um, you know, just sort of a scholar of the details of somebody's work, and sort of wanted to kind of come to terms with in the writing how to sort of intellectualize that feeling, especially with a band like Nirvana. Like I knew nothing really about the band except for they had something to do with a record label that I was very keen on, Sub Pop.
Sure.
The only reason we went was because our friend from Sub Pop had put the 7-inch out, and the young woman who was touring with Sonic Youth at the time and just doing our lights and selling our merch, who was the only person with us in the van other than the band. She did the graphics for Nirvana's first 7-inch label, and so that's the reason we went. Just to appease Bruce Pavitt at Sub Pop, and our and Suzanne did the artwork, and we had no idea that the band would shred our faces off like that. But I kind of wanted to just write about what that initial emotional moment was of actually sort of being in the room with something so astounding, and in some ways, I think I even sort of strip out the actual date. Like what date was it? What I sort of I kind of changed the writing to like it was in the fall it was a beautiful fall night. When we were walking from Hoboken train station to Maxwell's to see Tad and this band called Nirvana opening up for them, and without giving out all these details. I mean, like I said before, I really love detail oriented music literature. Like there's a Sex Pistols book that details every single day of every member of the band's life from when they first meet, and like which gig Steve Jones was at the same night the gig that Sid Vicious was at down the down the road, and all these kind of things. There's a David Bowie book that details every single day of his professional life. I love that, but I realize that's not a book that a mainstream publisher can really sort of put out there and campaign for. They want a book that sort of is more for for all readers. And so, to be fair to all readers, you don't want to sort of clog up your book with all this data. And so, it allowed me to sort of write a little more sort of prosaically, which I want to do anyway. Um, so it was definitely, wanting to sort of keep my Mr. Know-It-All in check, because it's like even my editor Yaniv Sarov from Doubleday Penguin in New York, when he was editing, and we spent all last year editing because the manuscript was about 800 pages. Uh, he would circle certain things and go like, "This is a little too Professor Moore," which I kind of understood, and but I just sort of I kind of I like that, but I also knew that I really wanted it to be about writing as opposed to information, because I like I said earlier, I find such joy in writing as a creative impulse that it was just sort of the artfulness of writing is what I really wanted to employ myself into, and so that was the primary essence of that, was to write, and and to make sure that nobody thought that I was another musician putting out a memoir that was ghostwritten, which most are. A lot are. Most
Sure.
musicians don't really write, and for better or worse, I don't really. I'm not being accusatory or judgmental about anybody who uses a ghostwriter. I mean, a lot of books are sort of dictated and then sort of put into kind of a readable context. But and I don't have an issue with that. But I knew that it was not what I was going to do at all. I really wanted it to be about writing. And so I wanted to have a book that sort of distinguished itself in the canon of music memoirs, where you could actually believe that I'm writing and I'm being writerly. And I hope to sort of, at 65 years old, have maybe achieved some kind of form of being able to be uh, looked at as a writer. I don't think I could have written this 10, 20 years ago.
It's hard to write a book, right? It's not
Well,
easy.
it certainly takes a lot of time, and it takes a lot of patience. It takes a lot of being able to sort of block out the any kind of any kind of disturbance in your day. I mean, it's impossible for anybody, especially in the atmosphere of today's world. With everybody with a laptop in front of them, it's almost entirely impossible. So you sort of, I would hear stories about writers like Jonathan Franzen sticking Elmer's glue into portals of his laptop and putting a blanket over his head for 20 hours a day.
Yeah, I've heard those stories. So I want to ask you about the story that you're telling in this book as it pertains to place, because your story is such a story of place to me. You and Sonic Youth are inextricable from Lower Manhattan and the punk and the post-punk scene of the 1970s and 80s. And I was thinking about your childhood, early part of your childhood in Florida, and then I believe there was a quick spell in Tennessee, and then you ended up, as you said earlier, in rural Connecticut, in Western Connecticut. Your father was a professor at a Western Connecticut University. And even though you were kind of out in the sticks, you did have proximity to New York within a relatively short drive. And I just found myself wondering, like, wow, in the absence of that proximity, if, for example, you had stayed your entire childhood in Florida and you had been an adolescent in Coral Gables, that's right? It was Coral Gables.
Yeah,
Yeah.
South Miami, Coral Gables. Yeah.
I'm like, man, I wonder what kind of music Thurston Moore might have made. I feel like he would have still made music, but I wonder what it would have been like. Have you ever thought of that?
Oh, all the time. I have always thought about like what would have happened if my father relocated the family to Tulsa, Oklahoma, or anywhere besides being an hour and a half away from New York City. and what that would have meant. And subsequently, I've become quite enthused about everything that was happening in like these secondary, tertiary kind of regional scenes across the USA, and which became really important to what underground music was all through the 80s and 90s. Was this kind of connective, collective energies from these regional cities, such as Tulsa, such as Minneapolis, such as Lawrence, Kansas, such Seattle, for God's sakes, and just sort of like all, we all kind of, as soon as everybody was able to tour, we would hit every single venue in all these towns, and you would discover all these scenes of bands that had come up. I make mention of it in the book when I start talking about a band like the Wipers, who early on put a record out of Portland, Oregon, and just like how these kind of new radical sounds are happening in places outside of the high profile London, LA, New York kind of axis of where the media eye is always. And that was really exciting to hear and discover records coming out of like these kind of more podunk places, as they say. And I remember going and visiting South Miami in the late 70s with my family sometimes, and especially around 77, 78. I remember visiting down there and seeing in the local freebie arts paper an ad by somebody saying, looking for people into Blondie and the Clash and the Talking Heads uh, to start a band with or something. And I remember being struck by it. And I was all of 19, 20 years old, thinking like, maybe I should stay down here and answer this ad, because then we would like, I mean, we would rule the scene. We were the only ones who would like
Right.
know about this music, as opposed to going to New York where like everybody was on board below 14th Street. And I didn't do that, of course, but I kind of later in the years, I would meet people from Dade County, Florida, around that scene, who actually also migrated up north and started bands and fanzines, and one of them ran a record store called Rat Cage. And some of them said, "Oh, I think I know who ran that ad," but they all sort of came out of that world, and through the years into the early '80s, they all found each other, and of course, like kind of uh, the whole regional punk and post punk scene was happening everywhere, and it started happening in southern Florida as well. And a lot of it was sort of centered around just like younger people, half generation younger than me, starting hardcore bands where they were discovering punk rock from each other, as opposed to sort of even any history of any other music. So a lot of hardcore bands were just, their first hearing of rock music was from the first Dead Kennedys album, for God's sake. It wasn't like they came up listening to Beatles and Stones and Kinks and, like we did. So it was just kind of like, that was really fascinating to me. It's like, wow, that's so primal. And that's like, you're inspired to start a band because the first thing you were hearing is Black Flag, and it was like, and so there was, I thought that was very special. And so, um, but yeah, I did wonder what it would be like if I didn't have proximity to New York. And
Yeah. Do you think you would have found these? Like, you think you would have found these post-punk guys who were putting
I would
ads
hope
in
so.
papers? You would hope so. Maybe you would
I
have,
would
but
hope
it's like
so.
it's hard to imagine you and the work and your body of work like outside of the context of New York. It's so integrated, and that place and time that you describe in your book, I missed all of that, and only kind of ever knew New York as a place that was like prohibitively expensive for creative people to live in. So
Well, certainly, yeah,
it's hard not to read it with like a sense of like
yeah.
you know sadness. There's something elegiac about your book when it comes to what has happened to New York as it pertains to like real estate and how creative communities have sort of been priced out.
Well, it's somewhat conflicted. I mean, it was certainly a place where you could go and connect with other people who are interested in this same idea of creating radical music or art or literature. And knowing that, you knew there was a lineage there, and so you kind of went there because of that. Whether it was, the New York Dolls or Velvet Underground before that. It was just like you knew there was this lineage there of writers like Allen Ginsberg and William Burroughs. It was all this New York thing. Um, that said, when I was in New York and living there from '78 onwards, I would see fanzines like Flipside or Slash from Los Angeles and be really very curious about what was going on in Los Angeles because that's it sounded so completely at odds and different than what was happening in New York. It was like it seemed younger, and it seemed like everybody was meeting each other and sort of connecting with each other like on a high school level, and then graduating, but still kind of uh, meeting each other at the same venues and record stores or whatever. It was a different world. It was like kind of more people were indigenous to LA early on, whereas in New York, a lot of the community came from outside. And in some ways, the only really indigenous communities were like the hip hop communities or salsa communities around the Latino communities, as far as new music. As far as rock and roll music, there was some uh, there were some people who were brought up in Manhattan and Brooklyn or whatever, but most people came from outside, coming out of universities and such, specifically Cleveland and for some reason Northern Florida. Um, and Boston, and just coming into New York. And for me, it was like you could live there. I paid $112 a month to live on 13th Street between A and B, but it came with a price. I mean, there were rough and tough streets, and uh, there was crime, and there was dirt and garbage, and there was it was financially destitute, and the U.S. government sort of let's just basically under Gerald Ford said let it burn, drop dead. It was, and so that was sort of the atmosphere, as Lydia Lunch so famously put it. It's like the apocalypse had already happened, and it was in some ways it was like it was this playground for as such, and you felt invincible as you are wont to be in 19, 20, 21 years old anyway. It's just sort of you can sort of block certain things that would be a little harder to process maybe at a later age, such as some of the a lot of the kind of societal human degradation that you would see. But as a young white male, I was fairly cushioned and comfortable in the construct of all this.
And you were
Uh,
6'6", so I
and
mean,
I was 6'6".
I feel
Yes,
like that helps.
I think it possibly did. Yeah. So New York was what it was, but you did not know that it was this sort of penultimate or ultimate time before the city would be renovated through real estate, and become moneyed. And I think all the cities sort of went through this. Even certainly London did to some degree, Paris, and certainly Berlin did for whatever with different factors. But it was almost as if there was a consensus that the cities needed to be saved by the end of the '80s um, in order for industry to continue and in any kind of in, in any kind of real way of monetization. So that was that became obvious with the advent of young professionals coming into the cities and being catered to, and it did price everybody out. But now we have laptops in suburbia, so
Right, right. Well, another thing that I was thinking about when it comes to your creative trajectory and your life story has to do with the loss of your father, which you write about. And this happened. This was like a signature event in your young life. This was late adolescence when this happened. So, a very tough loss. Your father was, as we mentioned earlier, a teacher, an academic, music teacher, and your house was filled with books and records and art. And you had a kind of groovy childhood in that sense. But your father's death happened at a point in your life where you were about to go off to college and sort of at a pivot and trying to decide, unless I'm misplacing it, please forgive me if I am, but I believe that happened right around the time you were deciding to go off to college to pursue journalism at Western Connecticut. But then you pretty quickly left.
Yeah.
and you took off for New York. You could sense that that was where your destiny lay.
Yeah.
And so, a question I have, and it's sort of similar to the one earlier about having moved around and having proximity to New York, is that in the absence of your father's death, do you think you would have gone off to New York? Were the two things related? Would he have pressured you, or would you have felt more of an obligation to sort of stay the course academically?
I have thought about that for sure. My father passes away in 76. It's I to write about anything that was sort of heartbreaking in my book, I kind of wanted to stay away from. I wanted to sort of mute um the kind of darker moments in my history, and I kind of wanted the book to be more sort of about the joyfulness of the first chapter is called Epiphany. It was like the joyfulness of exploring and discovering and I wanted the book to have that energy. I kind of thought like any kind of dark energy. I didn't really feel like I needed to necessitate that being in the book. I wanted the book to be this totem that kind of was magical, where it was all about this kind of benign force, and to not and infuse it with too much of bad vibes. And so, writing about my father's death was I felt was necessary because, in some ways, it was like, well, I didn't have any issues with my father. So there was nothing of conflict there. It was all about it was all about a great love between a father and a son and his family. But it was also about a year where it was a very radical transition in my life. So by him passing away and me going off to New York by the end of the year, at least going off to New York and becoming witness to what would be a vocation for me. That was really important. I kind of wanted to. I needed to sort of write about how that year was one of loss and one of like you know a period of defining my entire future. And so how to tie that together was just rather happenstance. I think if my father had lived, I have a feeling my trajectory into going to New York would have been somewhat similar, though predicated upon different realities. I don't think I would have, um, met the person in the New Haven, Connecticut record store who would have invited me by letter to come and rehearse in downtown New York with them. And then one thing led to the other, and the footpath would be different. But I think he would have been okay ultimately with me leaving university. And I think there could have been some headbutting going on there. I don't know, but I I do think he understood that there was something there was something of value and devoting yourself to music and art, certainly.
Sure.
And so I'm not sure how it would have played out. I really don't. Um, but
Well,
yeah,
you write really fun passage about you and your childhood best friend Harold Paris going to New York as teenagers, driving into the city to sort of like seek out your punk rock heroes and to kind of make contact with the stuff that you had been reading about and listening to.
yeah,
And there is a great uh, remembrance of this. What was it? Suicide and the Cramps. Was that the concert at
yes,
Max's Kansas City? Where like,
yes,
I believe Alan Vega of Suicide is like throwing drinks in people's faces and shattering glasses and like
yeah,
cutting himself, like sort of like the ultimate punk rock experience. And you
yeah,
guys are what, maybe 18, 19 years old and just mind blown.
right, yeah, totally.
I mean, that's
We
great. But
thought,
this is the
yeah,
time that you're in. You're in CBGB, Max's Kansas City. All of that stuff is happening at that time.
yeah. I was already, I was hyper aware of something going on in downtown New York that I was very interested in. I had already sort of been interested in music coming out of New York City, whether it was the New York Dolls or there was a band called the Dictators that were early on, and so I was kind of, to me, you know, if it had anything to do with with urban music and the kind of chaos that it kind of implied, I was just like really, I just was interested in what was going on the wild side of rock. I mean, Iggy and the Stooges, Iggy Pop came out of Detroit, but he made such a momentous, you know, marks in New York City by playing at Max's Kansas City and jumping up and cracking his head open, or hearing about these stories of him there. And then, I sort of talk about how there was still this idea that, you know, contemporary music for like radical youth was happening like in Woodstock and around the escaping from the standards of societal expectation and moving into the country and sort of, you know, smoking copious amounts of marijuana and just sort of getting lost to the country. And I wasn't really interested in that. In some ways, I kind of thought like, well, if that's the way it is, that's the way it is. I'll just be a hippie and I'll go off to the country and smoke copious amounts of marijuana and play music. I don't know. I just kind of wanted to be where the action was. But upon seeing an image or picture of the New York Dolls in New York, and all of a sudden there was this kind of band that was hanging around on subway platforms, I was far more sort of intrigued by that. It seemed just more. I don't know. There's something that just seemed more. It seemed like more. It seemed more thrilling, and it also seemed like it had a lot to do with this embrace of the essence of what rock and roll was. And it wasn't sort of discounting it as a music that was junior to, say, folk influenced rock music or progressive rock music. That had all to do with the ability of having a very learned and practiced high technique, with your instruments. And that the fact that it was like, it seemed like the New York Dolls were a band that just sort of picked up guitars, like last week, and plugged them in and learned a few bar chords.
Right.
But their ideas and their energy and everything else going on was just so great. Their presentation was just like to die for. And they were dressing up in women's clothes, but they were like these kind of wild hetero kind of maniacs. I was like, God, I was like, what is this? And then Patti Smith, who was writing poetry and writing this really incredible kind of rock journalism, music journalism, and then she was, you know, singing on stage with like another rock writer named Lenny Kaye, and like I talk about like, what does a rock writer sound like on record? When she makes that first 7 inch, I was like, I just wanted to hear what a writer sounded like singing on a record, and it was amazing. So there was something a little more. There's something about the fact that a lot of the music that I was hearing coming out of New York City, it just sort of seemed like it it had a it seemed intelligent, even though it was like kind of playing kind of like street tough at the same time. It was sort of there was this collision between being kind of sort of being kind of organic to the street wildness, and also being really sort of open to a lot of like new ideas that were coming out of like new literature, whether it be like William Burroughs or Susan Sontag or something. And that always impressed me because, I mean, when I first went to CBGB's, on any given night, it would be a band like the Talking Heads, who were sort of college graduate art students, who started a band that was really sort of like, very sort of angular and esoteric, and, very sort of knowing of how they were employing these kind of motifs from rock music. And, they're obviously very kind of like well educated, like, nerdy kind of, you know, kids out of university, on the same bill as like somebody like Johnny Thunder's Heartbreakers. And Johnny Thunder's was just like, he was like a city kid who was just like lost into like, you know, bad attitude and heroin and just sort of, and like living the glory of this. And it was like sloppy and dirty fingernails on, I used to sit so close sometimes because I like to study the bands that I could see like the dirt under Johnny Thunder's fingernails. I was just like, and the fact that these people were on the same stage, that collusion between this really kind of raw rock and roll essence and then this kind of more sort of new and kind of like art school take, I think that's sort of what defined punk rock in a way. I mean, certainly Malcolm McLaren was on board with that with the Sex Pistols. He's like, here's this guy who came out of like studying political science in like, in one of the finest establishments in Paris, coming back to London. It's just sort of like the kids who were stealing stuff out of his store that he and Vivian Westwood ran. He said like, I he loved them. He was just like, these little Dickensian characters. It's like, why don't you start a band and you could sort of be like the band mascots, he and so it was just like this kind of exploitation of these little street ragamuffins who turned out to be extremely clever in their own way. Certainly John Lydon was, and but that's that collusion always I thought was kind of the most one of the most defining aspects of punk rock, and I like that. I thought that was wonderful, and I thought I was always interested in people playing it up. I think Patty played it up a bit, and it was like when you look at when you look at like poetry readings at St. Mark's Poetry Project in the early '70s, a lot of the readers they have this kind of there's this sort of like street tough bravado they have in their voice, that sort of tends to change when the city changes. I think when it does become more muddy, there's this kind of new voice that kind of is purposefully more sophisticated, but that wasn't always the case. This is a whole other book I want to write about.
Yeah. Well, I mean, like, but what you're speaking to is just how vibrant of a scene it was. And that's something that really comes through in your memoir is there's a ton of talent in Lower Manhattan when you were there as a young man. And it's everybody from, Sonic Youth, Madonna, the Ramones, Talking Heads, Television,
Yeah.
Blondie,
Hip
uh,
hop, Fat Five Freddy, and
yeah,
yeah, I mean,
Jean-Michel Basquiat, Keith Haring. I mean, there were some real
yeah.
forces of nature in that place at that time. You have to feel a sense of like good fortune just to have been near it and to be around all those people and that energy.
It was an explosive demographic. I mean, at the time, I don't think anybody thought like we are of a certain generation that has sort of come into the same streets together to do whatever we're going to do. I mean, not everybody kind of, um, you know, is making work of too much notability. There's a lot of kind of sort of jive notes being played, but but it was kind of curious in a way that it was a generation. I was born in 1958, so I think it was this generation from like early to mid 50s, people born in like 53, 52, 53, on into like around that 10-year period of people kind of born 63 and early 60s, mid 60s, just coming of age at that time in the late 70s, early 80s. And it's kind of a curious demographic because in some ways it was sort of the last vestiges of people coming of age where the discovery of these of wanting to be in this vocation, have this, and to sort of deal with this creative impulse, it all really changes pretty radically by the time we get into digital culture and this digital medium and tech culture,
Sure.
for better or worse. I mean, and and so it always seems like when I wrote this book, I didn't want it to be like back in my days, Sonny. We used to drive for 3 miles to find the Clash record. I didn't want I didn't want it to be that way at all. I didn't want to talk about it being a better time or a worse time. I just wanted to write about it being a time.
It
You
seems
know,
it seems awesome to me. I got to say, from the outside looking in, it seems it's really fun to read about, and it makes me. I've always kind of wanted to. Wish I could have experienced that time in New York. I don't think I'm alone.
well, I
Um,
really wanted to write about. I really wanted to be a love letter to that period of New York City, and I used to have such a desire to run off to London because what I fantasized what was going on in London at that time was it was a fantasy, and I have no idea what would have happened if I did that. Or Berlin, like what was going on in Berlin at that time before the wall came down, or L.A. Around the mask period when the germs and the weirdos and X and everybody were starting. I would have loved to have been there. Or in San Francisco, like with the Avengers and the Dead Kennedys and all this. And it's just like I just happened to be near New York City, so New York City became the place that I gravitated to. And in retrospect, it's like it was yeah, it was insane. It was great. It was like, New York City is New York City. You just can't dispel like how significant that burg is. So to write about that specific period from the prism of being like, just some like 20-year-old uh, experimental noise rock musician. I was like, I do know that a lot of people wanted to know the story, but I also knew that I think that there was be an appreciation to actually be as descriptive as possible about what life was like day to day in that kind of world. And I could only give my personal recollection of it. There's not been certainly been other books by musicians writing about downtown New York. I mean, the Harley Flanagan, who was like the teenage bass player in the Cro-Mags, like this kind of classic New York hardcore band. I mean, he wrote a book about living in the East Village that makes mine seem like Mary Poppins. I mean, his is all his is
Right.
like his. It's like he's living in like the squalor of just like complete and utter crazed lifestyle of 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 just like drugs and cohabitating with a bunch of like lunatics and like these broken down tenement buildings on Avenue D. And his book is about that. But so I didn't live that life. I kind of kept it somewhat. I was somewhat of a had a bit of a conservative lifestyle compared to that.
Sure.
But
That's also why you've had a long career and have made a ton of music, I bet. I mean, it feels like a candle that burns at both ends, right? If you're living that way.
well, he survived. Thankfully, he's a good person, and I'm glad to see somebody like that can survive and write a book about it. But his book was really sort of just like, man, you wouldn't believe it. And I was like, well, I would believe it. Tell me more. I kind of wanted my memoir to not get shy away from really getting descriptive, and I really, and that was kind of for me the enjoyment of writing, because it was all about this. It was all about the joy of writing, and I kind of really wanted to be. I really wanted to, get my feet wet as far as like getting into the prose of writing uh, about place, about environment, and no matter what the experience is, you know.
Well, it definitely does that. And I also want to talk with you about your early adventures into music, and in particular, I'm curious to ask you, or I'm curious to know about your thoughts on creative chemistry, because I've hear about this and read about this a lot in the context of bands and music, that there is a certain magic that happens when a band works, and it has to do with the chemistry of the players in the band. You started out in early bands like Room Tone and the Coachmen, and eventually you meet Kim, you meet other players in the band, and you form Sonic Youth, and things begin to take off. It wasn't an overnight thing. There are many years you guys learned how to play with one another and, sort of built your chops. But there is something magical about the combination of musicians in that band. Would you agree? I mean, and can you talk a little bit about like just your thoughts on that, like how that works?
I think in some ways it's entirely providential. You know, when I when Kim and I meet, and I'm already sort of playing music with a couple of musicians, um, a young woman named Ann Demarinis, a drummer named David Key, and it was sort of as kind of an extension of what I was doing with these earlier bands from the late '70s that nobody ever heard of. The Coachman, Room Tone is a name that becomes the Coachman. The Coachman is the band that actually plays gigs. The few that we did play, and we did record a little bit, and that the recordings that we put out came out in the '80s on a label that the Minutemen ran at SST Records called New Alliance. I should reissue that record now that this book is out. Um, Jay Mascis of Dinosaur Jr. said it's the best record I ever made. um, I and he might be right. I mean, it's just like I think it's a really. I think the Coachman made a really. We were really good. We were really cool, but no, we got very little notice. Um, but anyway, I mean, when I started getting Sonic Youth together, I kind of the name Sonic Youth was always sort of like crawling around in the back of my head, and we would eventually sort of use that name when I kind of felt at a sort of a desperate situation when both Ann and not so much Dave Key, we had another drummer named Richard Edson after that, and they both kind of were in and out, and certainly Richard was, and Ann kind of just decided to step out, and it was just Kim and I, and Kim and I were living together, and so we were going to work together no matter what, and we enjoyed working together, obviously, and we were playing music, and for I kind of sort of at that point sort of just really kind of raised my voice a little more as like, okay, I'm just going to be the de facto leader here, because I was kind of all about the democracy of the unit, and it would certainly become more of that as soon as Lee came in, and certainly when Steve Shelley came in. But at first, it was kind of me sort of kicking the door down a bit, um, and I didn't really have any other recourse as far as like what I was going to do with my life in any kind of professional way. Kim was already sort of working as a visual artist. I mean, she could have easily followed her skills and her heart into the gallery world that a lot of her associates were involved with. And but for me, I was just like, no, I I'm um, I'm playing alternative tune guitar, you know, you know, and that's all there
There-
is to it.
There's no
I don't
plan
know.
B. There was no
I
plan
don't, I
B.
don't really have much of a plan B, and and but again, you're so young, you're not really sort of you're not intellectualizing or analyzing your life that much. You're just kind of going. You're just kind of you know you're getting through days without thinking about shelf life at all. I mean, that does come later, as you obviously know. But
Sure,
it's
yeah,
like when you're in your early 20s, you don't think about that. You feel you have a million years ahead of you, and so it is much more of a day to day kind of uh, existence in your thought processes. I I would say that what I said at the top of all this that I think it's very providential. I mean, the fact that we aligned ourselves with Lee Ronaldo early on, um, it just sort of he was one of many kind of interesting creative people around that scene, playing around with uh, the people that we felt were doing kind of mutual kind of work, such as Glenn Bronco or Reese Chatham, or a lot of music around their world and coming out of the kitchen center of downtown. Um, but it could have been anybody, and so the fact that it was Lee had a lot to do just sort of with our connection with him. We his personal his person. I mean, his personality was something we liked. We liked what he was doing with it when he was playing with Glenn and seeing him do other kind of work together. I don't know. It just sort of happened. So I think back about it, and it's like, um, what was it that brought the three of us together? And to the point where within a year's time, the three of us were working as a very sort of unified organism. And I noticed in most bands that doesn't exist. There's definitely it's definitely more thorny than that. There's always kind of one or two people who push one way and one or two people push the other way, or there's always this kind of um, there's no sense of a real flow between the consciousness of each person, and you recognize it certainly with with bands that have this kind of magic. And so I talk about that. I talk about like, what is it? What is the Beatles? What is this thing that happens?
right.
And the Beatles is there's a reason why the Beatles were so significant as a band all through the '60s was just because of that that ineffable quality of just of how they found each other locally and sort of uh, came up together as, you know, four really kind of different people, but also very understanding of each other's connection to each other, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, no, it's,
But
I mean, the
but
word that comes to mind is magic. It's just like you can't
yeah,
even really define it when it happens. I mean, the Beatles, just the simple way that their voices all fit together when they're
yeah,
harmonizing is incredible. Like it just seems so unlikely, especially, to be living that close to one another and to find one another and to have that thing. You can't manufacture it. It either sort of happens or it doesn't, right?
very true, very true. I think early on, the three of us, Lee, Kim, and myself, we kind of, I think there was this realization that it was it it had a it had a magical unity, and so we just like entrusted that, regardless of what acceptance or non-acceptance we had at that point. And when we and Bob Burt, the first drummer for a few years, he was definitely a part of that. But Bob eventually would leave because, again, I mean, I think he felt slightly um, at odds with what that nucleus of us three in the front were. And when Steve Shelley came in, um, I think it took a couple of years for him to actually sort of get into that flow as a fourth member, you know, uh, in that unity. But he did, and and it's something that will never go away. I think the four of us will always sort of have that unified. Well, we certainly have the history, and so I mean, it begs the question, like, will you guys ever get together again? It's like, well, we never, we never really, we never really like quote unquote officially broke up. We just stopped playing together because Kim and I separated.
Right. Right.
And it's like, so there's a problem there, but it's like, but it's like, in a way that unification will always remain,
Sure.
and
I mean, that's
so.
an unbreakable bond. And I want to talk to you a little bit about the creative process of Sonic Youth. And I'll begin by reading a quote from your book. This is you, I think, assessing the kind of player that you are on the guitar. You say, quote, "I never really learned to play the classics. I had basically gone straight from picking up a guitar to making my own brand of noise." That's interesting because I think I just saw a quote. I was like flicking through Instagram, and there was Kurt Cobain talking about how unschooled he was as a guitar player, like not reading music or distinguishing between sharps and flats. Like this was a very intuitive,
Yeah,
naturally gifted player, and yet you'll also have really great players who do have a more like scholarly approach to an instrument or a more formal training. It can come in all shapes and sizes. And I'd love to hear you talk about that, your approach to the guitar, and then also about how Sonic Youth, in a general sense, made a song. You guys
mhm.
rehearsed a lot. Bands have different approaches. Sometimes somebody will come up with some lyrics. Other times you're just sort of in the rehearsal studio making music together, and then you land on something. But you just talk
Yeah.
about the actual labor of making music.
Right. I think the most for me the most successful Sonic Youth music was the music that came out of a group improvisation when we'd get together, and there was no um, there was no there was no prepared uh, chord structures or song ideas, and we would just come in and we would just start playing. It's like we would show up and we would finish our coffees and smokes or whatever we were doing, and then we would just start plugging in and sort of start up. And that to me was always the most rewarding because it kind of came out of this group interplay that again was very magical. And when we got to the point where we could actually afford equipment that could record the rehearsals, that was really important because then we could sort of zero in on certain things that happened 30 minutes ago. Like, remember what you were playing? It's like, was it this? No, it wasn't that. It was, but then you could actually rewind the tape and there it was. And you could sort of study it. And it to me was like, I found the most rewarding. But at the same time, I liked constructing uh, song ideas at home, and then kind of realizing fairly quickly that what I would bring in would completely become modified by how Kim would relate to it, or how Lee would relate to it, or how Steve would relate to it, and I could never really dictate what anybody should play, nor did I kind of want to so much. And so I would sort of just begin playing this idea I would have for a song, and each of the other musicians in the band would sort of come up with different ideas. And if one of the ideas that they were playing, I found too jarring with like what I thought maybe the song should sound like, I would say something, but it rarely came to that. And so that's two ways of how we would write songs. Usually, when the instrumental versions of these pieces would come together, and we really got into like the editing and the truncating of like, okay, this is a good 4 minute song, 5 minute song. Hey, it's a good 8 minute song for God's sakes. And we were kind of known for like, having longer songs because, why not? And we found that it was like, they were, they had worth, being that long. And it's like, and in some ways that was part of being an experimental band, is just like that idea of like how long a typical song should be. There's something he said about the economy of a 2-3 minute song, and there was something he said about like the vista of a 12-minute song. How about if we just like, do a 30-second song, and how about we do a 30-hour song? Like,
Right.
that's being really kind of audacious in that way. We enjoyed being audacious, but it was usually after the instrumental aspect would be complete, is when we would begin to think about singing, or the actuality of writing lyrics. And a lot of that had to do, a lot of it came into a place where you wouldn't actually even tackle that until you got into the recording studio. And it's like, well, who's going to sing this one? Or who's going to sing this one? I kind of want to sing that one. I want to sing that one. And you would choose, and you would kind of barter a little bit sometimes. And then you would create your own uh, singing, which was like a whole nother kind of line of tonality and melody, if indeed you were actually going to employ melody. And I mean, both Kim and I were pretty challenged vocalists. I mean, Lee actually had a very sort of trained singing voice. But the whole thing of technique is sort of, Lee sort of had a very sort of trained guitar technique that he had come up with since he was a child. I had sort of a I had a slight technique of sorts. I gleaned how to play, fairly proper chordings and notation, but and I knew something about. Uh, I had some inclination of music theory just from taking piano lessons as a child and having a father in the household who was playing piano all the time. Kim just learned completely visually. It was just all about the patterns on the bass neck and the guitar neck that she would apply her memory or to, and she kind of figured it out thus. So it was completely self-taught in that respect. And but at the same time, it was sort of like the same thing with, we were talking about earlier, with like, somebody of the nature of Johnny Thunders being on the same stage as somebody of the nature of David Byrne, coming from two completely different places, but sort of meeting at a place where they kind of served each other in the dynamic that was going on in the scene. And in some ways, that was kind of the calling card of anybody in a band that was coming out of punk rock. It was just like there was no judgment of technique at all. So, you know, it's certainly not in Sonic Youth. So knowing that Lee sort of had this higher, that had more of an ability to play a higher technique of guitar, at least in a traditional sense, there was never any sense of like, well, um, I'm, I'm quote unquote better than you are. Nobody was better than anybody, and that was sort of like, as soon as you understood that, or um, allowed that to be the the idea in the band, that nobody in your band is better than the other in any musical terms, that was, you were truly a band, you know. And that was
Right.
like that was giving dignity and respect to each other as a group dynamic. And so that was super important. And we never talked about that. That was never something we came to terms with. I remember reading an interview with Tina Weymouth of Talking Heads early on, and she said, and she was answering a question that was not too unlike this one. And I remember her saying something that's like, well, there's one word we never use in our rehearsals, and that's the word boring. We never like, if somebody's coming up with something, we would never use the word that's boring, or, it's like, and I thought like, well, yeah, that is kind of a mean thing to say to anybody who's kind of
Sure.
like you're working with. But
Right.
it was interesting in a way. It was just like, that's not something um, we would ever say to each other, you know. And you know what? I think there probably are a lot of bands where like the guitar player takes his guitar off and throws it down and points at the bass player because like, dude, it's boring, man. Can't you come on? And
Right.
the fist fight will pursue, or they come, or a lot of bands are, you know, they break up because they just do not see eye to eye, and and it can, sometimes it becomes it becomes, I don't know, territorial. It just sort of becomes, there's this politics of positioning that happens in bands with hierarchies of like who's doing what at any given time or who's employing what in the band. And I've seen this happen, and it's the downfall. It's the downfall of any band.
Sure.
As
Yeah.
soon as that happens, it's done. You have to grow up. If you don't grow up, you're going to be in arrested development forever. And as most musicians are anyway, but it's a you
Yeah.
kind of do you kind of do want to sort of realize that uh, it's kind of it's okay to act your age
Right.
in rock and
Yeah.
roll.
There's a certain dignity, right, in just accepting your station in life.
Yeah,
And another notable and well documented aspect of Sonic Youth is the fact that there was a marriage in the band,
yeah,
and you were in a long-term romantic partnership with Kim, and then that ended. And your book sort of is pretty studious in avoiding a real deep dive into the weeds on that. But
yeah,
something that I want to ask you about is being in a public couple in a creative enterprise and having your fans mythologize you, because and I think you've done this with bands maybe when you were younger, coming up. It's a really natural thing, I think, for fans of bands to do,
mhm,
is to kind of project stuff onto people in the band, to sort of get into the weeds, wanting to learn about them and wanting to know what they're into and where they're from. And you start talking about them almost with your friends like they're your friends,
mhm.
like,
Yeah,
and they're not. You don't know them. But I think that this dynamic had to have been particularly acute when you're married to someone in the band and you have people sort of holding you up as this creative couple ideal. Can you
mm,
just talk a little bit about the challenges of that, and then also the challenges of deciding how to write about that
yeah.
relationship?
Well, I totally understand it. As you said, I invested a lot of um, kind of emotional mythologizing into like John and Yoko or something,
Yeah.
And I've worked a lot with Yoko Ono, and I've talked to her about it, you know.
I do the
She,
same thing, by the way. Like, they are to me like some sort of ideal. Like, that '70s John and Yoko thing is very much like a
yeah.
fairy tale in my head.
Well, I mean, that said, and I actually, I confided in Yoko that, um, as far as the Beatles are concerned, I thought she made them that much more interesting, and, but that said, she did suffer a lot of abuse and continues to from people who see her as somebody who, um, destroyed the world's greatest band. And that's really, that's something that she will always have in her life. And so I kind of relate to that. But for me, it's just sort of, I, I knew all through the band's, existence that there was always this, this notion of the strength that, Sonic Youth exuded through the relationship between Kim and I, and I thought it was really sweet. And we never really were having we were never very demonstrative in our um, you know in our marriage in any which way. So um, you never really sort of heard reports of us having any kind of like marital spats, in the press, but it didn't really matter. Uh, I think people just sort of took a lot of had a lot of faith in that. So I think when we broke up due to me falling in love with somebody else, it was really hurtful for a lot of people. It was certainly hurtful for everybody in our family and for my family, my wife Eva's family and Kim's family, and so for me it was just sort of like um, at this point I didn't really want to sort of have to sort of explain that so much in my writing. I think it would have been in the context of a book like this where there's so much information uh, in the book about so many different things to sort of squeeze that in there. I don't think it need. I think it would be undignified to quote unquote squeeze it in there. I think it would have to be something that would have to stand alone and not be you know uh, trying to make room in a book that was contracted for 300 pages is now 500 pages and was but even when I had an 800 page manuscript, it wasn't really something I wanted to sort of extol on, only because I knew that my decision was that I found it would be um, it's 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 something that I feel so private about and that I share with my family and my daughter and I don't really feel like I necessitates me sharing it publicly, even though we were public figures, only because um, I think it would definitely create more hurt if I sort of did go out and sort of explain what was going on with like my decision um, for ending our marriage. And it's not, so that's not something that I think I would want anybody in my family, particularly my daughter, and to some degree Kim, to hear me voicing publicly. So it's
That
just
makes
not going to
sense.
happen.
That makes
And,
human
and
sense.
and at the same time, I felt like there's something about there's something about it becoming public that it automatically you're automatically. I mean, I'm selling a book for God's sake, so you're sort of capitalizing on something like that. I don't feel comfortable with. I mean, to monetize my, my private life is not something I wanted to do at all in the book. But that said, I write about the death of my father, and it's like you're sort of capitalizing on that. And it's like, well, that's not the same. Uh, that's a different that's a different emotional reality than say than say heartbreak. You know,
Sure, and a more immediate family heartbreak, like you mentioned your daughter and stuff. Like I have kids. I can relate to
I don't. She
not
doesn't
wanting
need.
to protect your children and
I
stuff
know
like
she.
that.
Well, I know my daughter doesn't want that to be something that is going on in the writing of my book. And I told her that early on. I said, I'm not writing about that stuff. And she's like, thank you.
Right.
And so, yeah, but at the same time, I had uh, there was a young woman in the late '70s that I had a relationship with who was raped, and I kind of read a bit about that in the book as well. Is like and how I had to contend with that reality of this woman I was very close to um, experiencing rape, and I felt like I didn't want to write about that because um, it's really nobody's business. But it 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 was something that I thought it was such a growing experience for me at the time. And I wrote to her. I still keep in touch with her. And I wrote to her and I said, "Would you mind? Are you okay with me writing about this? I certainly will not if you wish I didn't. And I would like you to read it, before publication." And she was very, we're good friends. So um, she was okay with it, but I got permission thus, so I would never. I felt a little at odds with that, but I do. It was something I felt was important to write about because I don't really see too much writing about the that that kind of violation of abuse of and rape by men. Writing about
The
women and
impact that it had on you. I mean,
impact.
not
Well, yeah, impact on me, but also just sort of the impact that it had on me and how it kind of for me it just made me so it just made me so detest such violence towards women that exists in this world, and to really sort of have to sort of learn about that through a situation like somebody so close to you having rape exist in their lives. But I just feel like I never really read about men talking about it, in any which way. So um, that I thought that was a bit of a slippery slope for me, and I think if there's anything more difficult to write about in the book, even more so than my father's death, um, and or even the contemplation of sort of writing about like uh, your heart going elsewhere and divorcing, was writing about dealing with somebody that you loved who was raped at 19, 20 years old. Yeah.
yeah. Well, these are difficult creative choices, and you write autobiographically and you have to make them, right? Like there's
Yeah.
inevitably going to be stuff in there that's personal, but you don't have to tell everything. You can't tell everything. So you have to decide. And that's the that's the process, and that's
Well,
the editorial process.
learning about learning about feminism is like really essential for me all through the book as well. So I try to sort of have that exist without kind of like shining in my badge like, oh, aren't I a good feminist or something. I kind of want to be very careful about that because it's like, my God, I mean, but it's like for me it's like it's in some ways it's so essential to the nature of punk rock as a forum, because if anything it's a forum for a lot of just liberal ideology, and I think it's an incredible forum for feminist activism. And so I've always been sort of through punk rock. I I found that to be informed by feminism through that was really fortuitous for me, because I don't think it would have come. I don't know where that would have come from. You
Well, and I
know.
think being in a band with a woman, which is not the most usual set of circumstances for young guys in their 20s or whatever. A lot of times it's a bunch of guys, but having some
Yeah.
feminine energy in Sonic Youth,
Yeah.
I think is part of the band's appeal and the reason why it works so well,
Oh,
right?
very much so. Oh, very much so. It wouldn't be Sonic Youth without that at all.
Well, before I let you go, I want to ask you about a little bit about legacy, because Sonic Youth it never hit the heights of, say, Nirvana in terms of like the popular culture. You write about that, but it's an incredibly influential band. And it's a band that fed bands like Nirvana and Pavement and Sebadoa. There's a litany of indie rock bands and alternative bands that would point to you and Sonic Youth as being big influences. And something that you write about, and it has to do with the 1992 tour that you did in Europe with, what was it, Huggy Bear, Pavement, and Sebadoa. You say, playing with those guys, I could see how the model of independence, self governance, and defiance of mainstream standards of success that had defined us since 1981 had become commonplace. And that's as good of a line as any that I can point to in terms of trying to articulate what it is about Sonic Youth and your music and your approach to music that became such a touchstone for so many young people starting bands and continues to. Like, do you have anything to add to that? Do you have a sense of why your band has been kind of used as a model?
I think there's a certain romance to inaccessibility.
Right? Yeah,
I
I
mean,
get that.
it's just sort of like, um, it's like, it's, when D Boone from the Minutemen uh, said punk is whatever we wanted it to be, which is like kind of a, there's such a, it's almost like a, a Buddhist statement in a way, and in some ways, I always felt like, I sort of entrusted our quote unquote legacy to being the fact that we we kind of had a bit of a we had a bit of a Zen consciousness to the band in a way, and I think that kind of appealed to a lot of younger bands coming up, seeing that they would never really have to necessitate, having to sort of appeal to the expectations of the mainstream, in order to, uh, have like any level of regard, either self regard or sort of the regard from their peers, uh, that, um, it was to continue to be challenging in what you do is much cooler than trying to appeal to any status in the mainstream. I mean, Nirvana certainly, they it's such a weird. It became such a kind of distorted template for so much of what happened, and I think Nirvana knew that, and I think that sort of created a lot of conflict for Kurt. I mean, Kurt had other issues going on, but I think there was that ultimately was happening for him, and it kind of became manifest for him in his own life, where, um, all of a sudden, he became, um, the most popular boy in school, and it was like it was at such odds with him being not that ever,
Right. Right.
and so I mean, and so I think there's something about, um, this idea of just like, um, this kind of idea of finding beauty in deformity, maybe, I don't know, the scar lover kind of thing. Um, all I know is that I'm always, to me, it was like always about it was always about the attraction to otherness, and I think that was sort of what, if we have any, I think we kind of are the poster children for otherness.
But that's
you
a
know
good thing to be. I think that's a good thing to be. And I feel like, I've been listening to a lot of Sonic Youth over the past few days, like getting ready for this interview. And the music holds up, and there's something about just the sound. It just sounds cool. And I think that has to do with what a deep listener of music you and your bandmates are and were, and just some sort of innate talent. It's, there's something kind of ineffable and magical about it. But I think
well,
that,
we made a lot of records, and we were around for a much longer time than most bands,
right.
and and we all continue to do stuff out there in the sound world. um, I'm going to go see Steve Shelley play this Friday. He's drumming with the Bush Tetras, who were like a heroic band for me, like in the late '70s, who are back together, and they're touring with Steve Shelley. So, my God, that's wonderful. And so I'm gonna go say hi to them Friday. Um, Doctor's orders willing, and then, yeah, So I, in some ways, I always say like Sonic Youth was an apprenticeship to our later lives. So I like to think about it as something that kind of we did in our youth that sort of defined our whatever sensitivity we have in our later years. So, um, yeah, I'm just going to continue making records. I think I don't know if I'm going to tour so much anymore, but I am going to write more books.
Oh, you are? Okay. I was going to ask you.
Yeah, I want to write fiction. I'm working on a ghost story that takes place in like, it's like a no wave ghost story. It takes place in the Lower East Side, early '90s.
Oh, cool. Cool. Well, and you mentioned doctor's orders. I know that you had to cancel a book tour because of a health issue. You feeling okay?
Yeah, I have a bit of a heart issue. And I have like atrial fibrillation, um, and I'm on meds, like blood thinning meds. So
Sure.
I can't go to the airport. I'm not allowed to fly. I was
Got
supposed to
it.
be on a book tour right now,
I
and
know. I know.
yeah. So, but yeah, it just happened at at the worst time. You know, like right before I was ready to jet off, I went to see a cardiologist, and they took the test. And I've been having this issue off and on for years, but this year I felt it was more profound. Like there was times I could hardly walk. So my wife Eva took me to my cardiologist, and they said, "Yeah, you need to have there's a procedure that's highly successful. It's like 99.9%, which I will have in a couple of weeks, and we'll see. You know, most people say like the next morning you're playing handball, so we'll see."
All right. Well, I wish you well, and I am grateful to you for taking the time to talk with me. Congratulations on Sonic Life, your new memoir.
Thanks, Brad.
And
Yeah,
I wish you
wonderful
well.
to talk. Yeah, it's great to talk to you. I appreciate it.